Good morning and welcome to our panel, and good afternoon, depending where you are in the country. We're going to be talking today about the tyranny of an organized minority, confronting inconsistent free speech standards in higher education. My name is Marcella Burke. I'm the managing partner and founder of Burke Law Group, and we are very excited today to have a terrific panel of people who've been very outspoken on the First Amendment over the years, and also in light of recent events. And so what we'll do here is, instead of boring you with me introducing everyone, we'll let all the panelists say who they are, where they work, what they do. Also, what is it that made them want to participate in this panel today on this particular issue? Today, we'll have only a few high-level questions for our discussion. This is really going to be a conversation among a group of academics and also practitioners about this free speech issue that we're confronting more and more on a daily basis. And so why don't I kick over to Professor David Bernstein to introduce himself first.
Sure. I am David Bernstein, obviously. I am a professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School and also executive director of the Liberty and Law Center at the law school. And I've been interested in conflicts between anti-discrimination laws and freedom of speech since I was in law school. I wrote a book in 2003 called You Can't Say That, that dealt with those issues. And I've also been involved in sort of informally consulting people who are facing unequal treatment at universities, or allegedly facing unequal treatment based on their Jewish identity, which is sort of a Title VI issue, which is a little bit separate from the hostile environment issue that we normally see in that context.
Excellent. Professor Eugene Volokh.
Yeah, hi, I'm Eugene Volokh. I teach at UCLA Law School. I have been since '94. I'm about to move to the Hoover Institution at Stanford for a non-teaching research appointment. I have been writing about free speech and harassment law since 1992. I was writing that. I wrote an article on workplace harassment law, although it can apply to universities as well. And I've been following debates about free speech at universities pretty much that long. I've also blogged extensively about this on the blog that I run, where David and Todd are co-bloggers, called the Volokh Conspiracy. We've been around since 2002 and have been blogging on and off about disputes at universities, free speech disputes at universities ever since.
Excellent. How about Jay Edelson, guest of honor?
Thank you. Yeah, Jay Edelson. I'm a plaintiff's attorney. We have about 100 people at our law firm. I come at this from a very different perspective, not an academic perspective, but more of a practical one. And everybody else in this panel has already agreed that if they do take issue with anything I say, they will argue with one hand behind their back, which I appreciate. So I'll have some shot. What really matters to me is getting lawyers to my firm and to other firms who have been trained well, and haven't been corrupted by universities and law schools, which I think have just very different agendas. And then what has happened more recently since October 7th has had more personal impact on me. So I come at this discussion kind of through those lenses.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And finally, we have Professor Todd Zywicki. Please tell us about yourself and why you decided to join us on this panel today.
Thank you, Marcella. I'm Todd Zywicki. I am, as of today, my last day is the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Bruce Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization, the University of Colorado. Next semester, I'll be back in my permanent position as George Mason University Foundation professor at Antonin Scalia Law School. My interest in this goes way back. To the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person who has ever gotten speech codes repealed at 2 universities, both at Dartmouth College when I served on the Board of Trustees, and then at George Mason as a faculty member. So this is something I've been working on for a long time. And I think my overarching objective today is to try to find out what in the world that painting is behind J, which I think would be a relevant question to address.
Well, I want to wait to answer that. Once you start seeing the mural move, then it gets more exciting.
Oh, wow. We can save that for Q&A. That could be another first on this panel. So everyone, we're so excited about this conversation, and we've been sort of talking about this in Federalist Society for, the past 30 years. It's sort of why the Federalist Society exists. We want to make sure that conservatives have a place to organize and to have opportunities to discuss legal interpretation in schools, and not just in law schools, but in universities. And so it's always been a foundational issue for those of us who've been involved in the society. And so where do we find ourselves today? There's been a number of sort of cultural flashpoints that have brought up speech in the academic context. Charles Murray being canceled from college campuses was sort of the beginning of this trend, the trap house gate. Our friend Ilya Shapiro, fired from Georgetown, or not fired, or whatever happened there, whatever he negotiated in that deal. The Evergreen incident in the Me Too movement, students barricading university presidents. Kyle Duncan at Stanford, I think, was sort of a real shot across the bow for a lot of us that, things are changing a little bit. It's getting a little more aggressive. Kristen Wagner at Yale. And then law firm letters, in the wake of Hamas, and law firms making different comments, and an associate at Sidley being fired for making a comment about law firm letters making comments about Hamas. And so it's sort of like these speech issues are coming to a head. And we had then October 7th, and that kind of brings us to where we are today, that what's happening in academia with academic leadership and students, and who can say what, and where really are we in the law and as a movement, as the conservative legal movement. And so that's the first question. Why? Why do campuses, what was the original sin? The places that should be hypothetically the safe space for speech have now seemed to become some of the most hostile spaces for speech. And it's hard to say which side to take sometimes. We see people having their employment threatened on either side of the aisle for different comments being made either way. So I think we'll start with Todd. Do you have a theory on what was the original sin here?
Yeah, I think one of the problems a mistake we make, Marcella, is that we who believe in the rule of law and free speech believe that everybody buys into that premise. And if you think that there is truth, that the purpose of the liberal university is the pursuit of truth, then the logic of free speech follows, easily, right? It doesn't take 300-page book to do that. The problem is that the people, the left today and the left on campus today do not believe in free speech. They fundamentally do not believe in free speech for a variety of reasons. They don't believe there's a truth. There are truths, for example. They believe that truth is indiscernible because it has to be processed through your own identitarian framework. And what they're really doing is adopting the old ideas of Herbert Marcuse, which is repressive tolerance, which is that powerful people believe in free speech. We write the rules on speech. We basically use speech as a way of justifying an unequal power structure in society. And they believe, as they've said, in equity rather than equality. And so in their view, they simply do not believe in free speech. They believe that speech is a vehicle for upholding an unjust system. So this is what leads them to ideas like the idea that speech is violence. If speech rationalizes the current regime, then it's basically institutionalized violence. Silence is violence, all these sorts of ideas. And a good example of this is in their worldview, it's not important to repress error. Right. So when they say, well, you don't expect us to hire flat earthers into the science department, those theories can be rebutted by old fashioned Enlightenment science. What's important to them is to repress truth. or things that could be true. The most highly sort of conflictual issues that we talk about, and where they believe that certain scientific truths and the like could actually be weaponized in their view for political purposes. And we saw this last year in Nature magazine, where they announced that scientific freedom has to be balanced against the potential social good or harm that could be done by purely scientific research. And so I think and so this explains why, for example, ad hominem attacks they think are allowed. This is why violence they think is allowed, because speech by the powerful is just another form of violence. And a lot of the ideas we see now of repressing speech, of canceling people, of attacking people's, of lying, just blatantly lying about people is all fair game if what you see is this is a power game that they're playing rather than a shared search for truth game as we've always thought of it.
All right. So Professor Bernstein, can you comment on what you think what the original sin is here?
Sure. I don't really disagree with anything Todd said. But the one thing is missing is when this all started in the mid to late 80s, the universities were still almost entirely under the control of the traditional liberal establishment, who, they were not Marcusians or radical leftists. They tended to believe in the traditional mission of the university. So what happened? Why did they not man the barricades, so to speak, to defend the university? And I think we have to look, unfortunately, in part, to policies that were well intended to try to bring minority students onto campus. And what leading universities did, of course, is they gauged racial preferences, and the gap between white students and white and Asian students and minority students, especially African American students, was really huge. If you look at the book The Shape of the River by former Harvard President Bach, the statistics are pretty stunning, like 300-point gap in SATs. Now, SAT isn't a be-all and end-all for everybody, but on the average, you'd expect students who have 300 points higher in their SATs to do a lot better than students on the average who have 300 points lower. And this manifested itself right away. You had African-American students failing out, Hispanic students to some extent also failing out, struggling, taking easier classes. And the obvious response to that would be either you have to modify your affirmative action policies, or you have to do something to help these kids get really well prepared for college before they start, an extra year before college or intensive tutoring before college, whatever it might be. The problem was that universities, for a variety of reasons, were dedicated to the proposition that even though everyone knew that they were gauging these preferences, to not acknowledge that the preferences were meaningful. Their line was that every group on campus, every student deserves to be here, is exactly equal. All groups are equal. And any differences you see have to be because of, something else, rather than the obvious academic gap entering. And something else was argued by the far, it must be institutional racism. Well, wait a second, where we have all these special programs for minority students, we have special dorms, we have special this, we have special that. How could you say we're being it's hidden racism, unconscious racism we can't see. And what we need to do is to make these minority students feel more comfortable. And once they feel like they're really part of the university and not just outsiders who are guests, and they will then achieve at the same level as the white and Asian students. And every time that doesn't work out, the answer is we need more and more things to make them feel comfortable, including suppressing speech that makes them feel uncomfortable, including having special departments that are ideologically completely on one side in a way that we think will make minority students feel comfortable. So a academic department of Latino studies, maybe, we're just going to hire people to make Latinos feel better about being Latino, not necessarily based on academic standards. So I think that is something of a corruption of university, but it also answers the two questions you started with, or the way I perceive that you started with. One of which is, why do we have so many, where these speech restrictions come from, and why are they unequally applied? Because they're never meant to just get rid of ideas that make anybody uncomfortable. They're very specifically geared towards making sure that certain underrepresented minorities with certain political views, because those are the ones we really want at the university, are not made uncomfortable.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to kick it over, to Professor Volokh first, and then we'll send it over to Jay. Jay's our special guest, so he gets to go last and, think of the most clever thing to say after we've all said our opening remarks. But please do go ahead, Eugene.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with everything Todd and David have said, generally speaking. The one thing I don't agree is formulation of this as original sin. I appreciate it's a colorful metaphor. It leads one to think about all sorts of things, such as I understand, not that I'm a good Christian or any sort of Christian at all, that original sin is something that passed on from generation to generation. We cannot be free from it other than by allegiance to certain ideologies, and perhaps not even then. I don't like to think of it this way. What I like to think of this is a matter of human nature. It's human nature to want to restrict speech that you sufficiently dislike in various ways. Just as Holmes talked about that. Persecution for the expression of opinions, he said, has always seemed to him perfectly rational. If you think some opinion is evil, well, then why should people be able to spread that evil? If you think it's offensive, why should they be able to offend people? So it's a perfectly normal facet of human nature. At one point, though, depending on whether you view this as a decision made in 1791 or a decision made by the Supreme Court in the 1900s, or perhaps a mixture of those, we concluded that it is important to protect even opinions that people, from their perspective, justifiably want to suppress. And this yielded a body of law that for a while, I think, probably in the 1980s and 1990s, as best I could tell, got considerable adherence, in particular within the American university, where in some respects the protections have been seen as especially strong. So what happened there is there was something of a coalition. The university at the time indeed was mostly center-left, but I think people on the left, on the far left, viewed free speech in many ways as an important tool because they remembered the government's using restrictions on speech to go after both people on the extreme left, like communists in the 1950s, and the civil rights movement and others. So people on the far left, many of them viewed it as an important tool against the conservative establishment. People on the center left bought into this ideology, which was very much a part of the center left. And the people who there were on the right and center right and in the center were generally on board with it too. I think there were still some conservatives, traditionalist conservatives, who went along with what used to be very much the conservative view, which is that it's important to restrict certain kinds of speech, certain kinds of ideas and certain ways of expressing it for a variety of reasons having to do with civility or having to do with suppressing advocacy of violent revolution and such. But in any event, while there were some imbalance, there was this coalition. This coalition still remains in certain measure at universities. It's important to realize that while at universities sometimes there is substantial suppression of speech through official discipline, and there is a lot more suppression of speech through social pressure, which has always been a more complicated question. There's also a great deal of protection for speech. That would be surprising to someone who just thinks, oh, human nature is to try to suppress views you find sufficiently offensive. There are many universities at which many speakers, including ones that are much disliked, are allowed to speak. There are faculty members who have not yet, perhaps, but perhaps not even in any great danger of being fired, despite their heterodox views. So there remains some degree of this protection, partly because there still are a lot of people in the traditional liberal center-left, partly because there's still a few people in the center and center-right, and very rarely in the serious conservative right, and partly because even some people on the progressive left go along with it, in part because they're seeing, well, wait a minute, some states, oddly enough, shocking as it may seem, are run by Republicans, run by increasingly conservative Republicans. And now they're trying to restrict speech in various ways. Maybe we ought to remember that free speech ought to be protected. I think what has happened is a mix of several things, including but not limited to the following. One is because of the spread of both hostile environment harassment law and certain concepts that go along with it, the notion that certain speech can be seen as violence or as conduct or as making people feel unsafe and so on and so forth. There had been a good deal of pressure from, among other things, both government authorities and internal entities like diversity offices that are aimed at implementing governmental rules like Title VI and Title IX, considerable pressure to restrict certain kinds of speech. And the defenders of the speech weren't as institutionally attentive to it, despite the considerable number of such defenders as the people trying to suppress the speech have been. A second thing was this sense for a while on the left that the left is in the ascendancy, and certainly at universities, it has all of this power. At the federal level, for say during the Obama administration, it did have a good deal of power, and the left positions of the left are the views of the future. And that therefore you don't have to worry too much about your speech being restricted because you're going to have all the levers of power. So I think that was part of the concern, which was particularly easy for people to assume, part of the perspective, particularly easy for people to assume when they were looking just at universities, which were indeed the left for a while was very much in the ascendancy and remains so in considerable measure. So the question really, and again, one reason I don't want to talk about original sin is, what do we do going forward? We don't need to have a theological answer. We need to have a political answer and a psychological answer. And I think there are two paths going forward. One path is to rebuild a coalition in support of free speech, where we basically talk to people on the left and say, some of you already have long supported free speech principles. You thought there was safe to have certain kinds of what you saw as narrow exceptions. Now we're seeing they're not narrow exceptions at all. And in order to defend your liberal values, we need to protect free speech because that's part of your liberal values. You need to rediscover it. Folks on the far left, maybe you think that free speech is oppressive in certain ways, and in your perfect world, you wouldn't have free speech for certain kinds of speakers. But you've got to realize that you and people, your allies, are being threatened by attempts to suppress sharply pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel speech, by attempts to restrict speech in places like Florida and various other places. That coalition you were on board, on which you were on board back some decades, that needs to be rebuilt to protect you and the people you care about. And conservatives, you need to remember the lessons you learned in the 80s, 90s, aughts, where indeed traditional conservative calls for restriction for free speech were much muted, and conservatism became much more embracing of free speech. So that's one path. Another path, of course, is another coalition, a coalition of restrictors. To say, where people on the left say, yes, it's very important for us to ban hate speech and speech that makes people feel unsafe and such. And people on the right say, absolutely, that's why we need to ban sharply pro-Palestinian speech and a variety of other speech and critical race theory to the extent that it's a divisive concept that makes white students feel unsafe and such. That's what we need to do. And of course, we don't like the people on the far left, but on this point, even a stop clock is right twice a day. So the question is, I think, which coalition is going to be built and most effectively going forward? That is, I think, the real issue.
All right. So let's then kick it over to Mr. Edelson.
Okay. First, what a fun conversation to be part of. In some ways, I feel like anytime I participate with FedSoc, that it's like this conversation has been going on for decades. And I just see every so often I'm invited to it. So I don't totally speak your guys' language, but I think that might be helpful. So a couple of things. First of all, I come at this, and I'm going to lose the audience here, and that's fine. I come at this as someone who is liberal. The best U.S. president we've ever had was Jeb Bartlett. I stand by that. Now, younger people won't know the reference that he was president of West Wing, very liberal, very smart, very effective. So I actually don't view this as such a clear divide between conservatives and liberals, and Gene kind of touched upon this a little bit. Here's my take. So I view this really as a problem on the extreme left with extreme progressives. And I believe that the DEI movement, which a lot of us liberals supported, we either misunderstood or it's mutated in a way that's really been scary. So I've watched as as progressives have talked about, we've got to change our language and we've got to create safe spaces and their trigger words and all of that. That, as someone who's liberal, has been a little bit difficult for me because I do believe in free speech. I do believe in the exchange of information. And I do believe that there are social norms that can create easier ways for dialogue. We're all being polite to each other. We're allowing each other to speak. That is a nice thing that helps. I never liked, I was an adjunct professor at Berkeley, and I was instructed that the first thing to ask my students was what gender pronouns they wanted to use. As someone who everyone comes at it from a personal view, as someone who's an introvert and has my own kind of worldview, I just thought, why would everyone necessarily want to be identified as that? I would be very offended if someone said, before you speak, say what religion you are, or what your IQ was, or any other expression of myself, because I don't think there's one thing that defines me. So that started making me a little bit uncomfortable. What I think is that the real problem, the thing that I'm struggling with, is that what I view as the extreme progressives, they don't. I guess this goes to Todd's point. I don't think that there's a consistent logical philosophy behind it. It is, we don't like free speech when it's about subjects we don't like. But then if it's something that supports our broader agenda, then we're going to say free speech. And that's the stuff, especially with what's been happening at the elite universities more recently, the testimony by some of the different presidents of universities, which has really been difficult for me to understand. And I do feel like the progressive left has lost its way, and I'm eager to talk about them more with all of you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. I'm going to add some thoughts too on this piece. So I do think there's sort of an original sin. And I think that, what's the apple that we bit that took us down a path where there's an uneven distribution of who gets to say what on a place like a college campus. And I think for me, I think on a higher level, it's a strategic issue. I think that it's a failure to understand strategy, a failure or a refusal to understand opponents of free speech and what their goals are. I think Todd touches on this in some more aggressive comments he'd made at the start, which is that there are people who are against free speech, and that's the goal. And that our goal in the Federalist Society typically is we would like to see a free society, and we have strategies to implement that society with a written constitution and with separation of powers and with state federalism and all these types of things. And then we have different tactics, different laws. We have antitrust laws. We have tort reform. We have different things. And so what happens on our side of the movement, I think, is that we fail to recognize that an anti-speech movement, with that being part of one of their goals, probably a strategy of a larger goal, and the tactics there. And so our tactics are things like having a written constitution, and our opponents' tactics are things like use slogans and manipulate language and redefine words. And it's like we're playing two entirely different games here. And we have a complete fundamental misunderstanding. And then we don't realize, or at least we're insisting that, we're up against Tip O'Neill still. And that's just not the world we live in anymore. The Overton window has opened, and it is something that a lot of people refuse to acknowledge or to admit. And so on a fundamental strategic level, not knowing what we're up against, refusing to live in 2023, but being stuck in 1994, and using essentially conservative legal slogans to defend why we aren't standing up for ourselves. And so we can get more into that later, and we'll talk about, at the end of this conversation, what are some things we can do to push back on some of these trends if we think it's necessary. But my opinion is that, having a coalition of free speech on campuses with people who have no interest in free speech and are winning and have no incentive. More government to solve the government's problem. Again, this is just a failure of goals, strategies, and tactics, and understanding and accepting what we're up against. So we'll continue that discussion at the end of our conversation when we talk about, what to do. We do want to talk about these interesting distinctions, though. So for our next question, it'll be distinguishing harassment from speech and the role for distinguishing the appropriate role for higher education, teaching, modeling on tone and mutual respect from interfering with substantive ideas and disagreement in a consistent way. And so we really want to touch on that inquiry here. How do we balance harassment from free speech and make sure that that's also imposed even-handedly, regardless of who is speaking and what they are speaking about? Because currently it seems very obvious that it depends on who is speaking and what they're saying is how to expect how they'll be treated. And so who wants to go first on that one? Any volunteers?
Well, can I speak a bit to this?
Of course.
Look, in any kind of democratic debate, there are people out there who genuinely do not share your values, and who may be awful people, and they think you're an awful person. That happens in a lot of situations. There's also a pool of people out there with whom you have common ground. And the question is how you reach out to them. Of course, that is a question that's also in light of how the other side is reaching out to them. Let me just give you a different example, gun control policy. There are people out there who think, well, gun rights are protected by the Constitution. Gun controls are always a bad idea. They're always tyrannical, always wrong. There are people on the other side who think we should ban all guns, and if that means locking up lots of people and ruining their lives, and if that's what it takes to get this ban implemented, perfectly fine. We don't care that these are otherwise law-abiding people. We think they're all very dangerous, and in any event, even if they're not, their guns are. And there are people in the middle who say, look, I'm not in principle. It's not like in principle I think all guns have to be banned because guns are evil. I do think they're dangerous. And if you can persuade me that they're really very, very dangerous, and that the only way to keep my family and me safe is to try to ban them, like some countries have in some measure done, well, then I'll be open to that. On the other hand, I certainly sympathize with the argument that, law-abiding citizens are the only ones who will comply with that. So if you can persuade me that, in fact, particular gun proposals gun control proposals are actually not going to be effective for various reasons. Maybe gun decontrol is going to be more effective. I'm open to that too. Now, if you are a gun rights supporter, which I generally am, and you just see the second group, the people who think guns are evil, gun owners are evil, we should ban them all, then the question is, what do you say to them? And some gun rights supporters say, all we say is, if you try to take our guns, we'll shoot you, right? That is ultimately what was this? Force is the old motto. Force is the ultimate reason of kings. Well, maybe that's true in democracies too. I like to think otherwise, though. I think the successful gun rights supporters are ones who reach out to the people in the middle. So I think the same thing is true at universities. There are some people who just say, you're awful, evil people, and it is itself a virtue. It is itself good to try to suppress you. And to the extent that means we'll expel you, or more likely we'll just deter you from saying anything, that's wonderful. That is itself a value, even apart from the functional benefits that this may provide in getting certain policies implemented. There are some such people. We're not going to persuade those people, probably. But we don't have to persuade those people, because there are other people, some of them in university administrations, some of them in legislatures, some of them among donors, and so on and so forth, who might be persuaded. So that's why I just want to just make sure that we realize that the fact that there are people out there who completely disagree about the very fundamental principles we're talking about doesn't really resolve the answer much, unless we think they're in the majority, in which case I don't know what to do. The real question is, what what do you do to reach out to the people in the middle? And the evidence I've seen suggests there are very many people in the middle, and that often it is attempts to reach out to them have been quite successful. And the question is, how do we make that work?
I wouldn't mind responding to that.
Please, please.
I would actually go further than Gene, which is that I actually like talking to the people who are most opposed to me the best. And I've not given up on them, and I hope they haven't given up on me either, because they disagree with what I say. So, we've taken a pretty public stance that with regard to the congressional testimony by Harvard President Gay and others, that perhaps calling for the genocide of a group of people is not the greatest thing. And I'm happy to explain why I think that our stance is consistent with free speech. But one thing that's been interesting is I've gotten so many emails from people, and a lot of them are very supportive and a lot aren't. And I like to engage with people, especially the ones that really disagree with me. So I get the emails that I am a Zionist, racist Jew who just wants to kill Palestinians. My view is, great, like let's figure this out together and figure out how you came to that view, because I've never said anything like that, and actually see if I can get a better understanding. And through a number of conversations with people I'd never met before, we were able to find common ground. When I kind of dug a little bit deeper, I found that a lot of people, they're just so focused, as people have been saying, on these slogans, and they believe it at a deep level. But if you actually engage them in a real debate, something else can happen. They have to be open to it. But most people are, especially when people are reaching out to me specifically. I figure there must be some openness. It doesn't work all the time, but I do think that is kind of what is that's a fundamental promise of free speech, which is that we allow people we don't agree with, we encourage them to say things that may be personally repulsive to us, so that we can engage them. So they're not just doing it in a separate room and they never hear from us. So that would be my take on it, at least.
David or Todd?
Sure. So on the issue of what we can do about it, I mean, sure. Well, I think there's two complementary things that seem at odds but really aren't.
Or David, can I so not quite what we can do about it, but sort of, can you talk about the distinguishment between harassment and speech? And then next, we're going to talk about some sort of what we can do about it. But like, there's just sort of this interesting role on a college campus of free speech, of course, but then it's almost the tone of mutual respect and that kind of thing. And so how do we address that? There's an awkward imposition almost of self-control that is helpful when you try to have things like free speech on a college campus. So can you just talk about the inconsistent norms on the speech versus harassment and what we think about that?
So look, I'll give you examples of things that seem to strike me as being obviously unprotected, but that right now, at least some universities aren't enforcing, because they will say, if you ask them if they're willing to comment, that, well, we have to give each side an opportunity and we don't want to crack down on anybody. Disrupting classes, disrupting speeches, occupying library buildings, chanting loudly, either indoors or outdoors in a way that disrupts other people, making threats to individuals, or even saying things that isn't phrased as a threat, but a reasonable person would take as very threatening, like you should be raped and murdered just like those people in Israel. And it's very and it's bizarre, or for that matter, just demonstrating in ways that violate laws that have been upheld and are reasonable, like wearing masks. And it's very interesting because a lot of these things, if they were targeted at groups that have been traditionally the focus of DEI and so forth, the university, even just microaggressions would be subject to, almost hysteria sometimes on campus. I mean, my favorite example of this is that over the last several years, there have been several examples of someone at some elite campus, usually in the Northeast or in the West, in very liberal areas, finding something on campus that somehow vaguely resembles a noose. And this happened, for example, at Wellesley College. Like Wellesley College is not exactly a big KKK stronghold. There was all like, "Oh my God, the KKK is here, and they're threatening to lynch black students because we saw this rope that was shaped vaguely like a noose." And there are teach-ins, and the university president sends out all sorts of emails to the whole campus and to alumni and gives speeches and calls in the FBI. And then it turns out when they investigate that someone, is just like had a piñata up for someone's birthday and left the rope there. It wasn't really ever shaped like a noose to begin with. And then everyone just sort of forgets about it. But on the other hand, some of these examples where people I've talked to have been accosted on campus and said, you should be raped and killed, you're a Zionist pig, or have got other kinds of threats, or people, there's an incident on my own campus where someone holding some sort of Israeli-related flag was actually attacked by a few other students. And, our university president tends to be voluble about lots of other things, including things that go on off campus, but hasn't said a word about that, right? So I think there are some relatively clear lines. I mean, Eugene is probably the strongest. I'm not sure about Jay, but Eugene's probably the strongest purely free speech proponent here without other considerations entering. And I know Eugene has written about, so those things that are actual harassment, threats, disruptions, those don't come within free speech, but nevertheless, universities are allowing them when it comes to, Jewish students being harassed, or, really because they feel it's like the people of color who are protesting because they've arbitrarily decided that Palestinians are people of color and Jews aren't. But it's a completely inconsistent standard of what gets the university officials' attention and what does not.
I'll just add a few words, which is first, as David lays out, this isn't a hard line in most of these cases between harassment and behavior on one hand versus free speech on the other. Dave gave it, a college freshman could distinguish the differences David was saying about these things. But the second thing is there's a more general point that you are raising, Marcella, which is, I'll go back to the idea about thinking of this as sort of a game played by certain rules. The free speech game has clear distinctions between harassment and intimidation and those sorts of things, which are inimical to the idea that what we're engaged in is a shared search for truth and a conversation among equals where we try to understand each other's position. That is not the game they are playing. They're playing a power game, where they're trying to, where they see this is not a share for truth. They see it as a zero-sum game. I win or you win. There is no shared understanding, right? Either your version of reality or my version of reality prevails. And that's a totally different game. And we need to realize that's the game they're playing and stop pretending like they're playing the same game as us, because that's a lot of it. I'll just say three quick things about this particular issue, which is the first is fundamentally the people on campus don't care about this distinction. Why? This is what I learned from my experience with speech codes. Every professor I've talked to, speech on campus is handled by college bureaucrats, not by the faculty. Faculty, we can talk to her blue in the face. As we know, we can adopt Chicago principles. But the speech codes at George Mason, for example, were written by some assistant associate dean for student life, who I never met, never had any idea who it was, but there's some university bureaucrat with zero academic values. Their job is to keep kids from getting their feelings hurt. The second idea is these students have learned how to manipulate this process. Right? They talk about feeling unsafe. They're literally unsafe if somebody somewhere on campus is saying something they don't like. That's completely preposterous. We all know this is preposterous, yet the game is developed and the bureaucrats have developed where they pretend like that's actually a serious statement by these people, and they enable that, right, by serving it up. Again, it's the bureaucrats. The third thing that I've observed among talking to other faculty colleagues, and have not seen this in my law school, but what students are doing now are things like weaponizing teaching evaluations. So what you will have is left-wing students will simply gang up on a professor, say a Federalist Society professor, and just give them gratuitously bad teaching evaluations, just write on their teaching evaluations that they're racist because they don't like what they're doing. And obviously what this is, if you understand this as a power game, it's a power game, not a shared for truth game. What they are doing is making it dangerous for faculty or other students to say things on campus. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine is a constitutional law professor, actually teaches in a red state. He told the story a few years ago about teaching the Obergefell case in class. And one of the students in class had the temerity to refer to a brief that was filed that talks about the benefits of, having a traditional marriage for kids, and referred to all the social science evidence. This professor got trashed on their teaching evaluations at the end of the semester because there were other students in the class who said, you should not have allowed that student to express those views in class because I felt uncomfortable and unsafe by that student expressing those sorts of ideas, right? All of this is outside. That's clearly not harassment. That's clearly not anything wrong, right? To allow a student to bring that sort of discussion into the classroom. Yet what we're seeing is this constellation of bureaucrats, of activist students, and all these people basically just overrunning this distinction, this nice fine distinctions that David and Eugene are drawing, and a complete lack of any backbone of anybody on campus to stand up to it.
Okay, great. Okay, guys, we're getting interesting. So we have a hard stop in 25 minutes, and that is going to fly by. We had basically two high-level questions sort of left, and I'm going to combine them into one, and you can decide what to comment on, but that does not mean you all get double the time. And so the first is, what have we seen in the courts? How have we seen the courts respond to any of these issues? If there's anything in particular you'd like to comment on, there's the Missouri Biden case, there's pending Title VI cases. If any of that sounds interesting, please comment on that. But also, there's the question of what can realistically be done to address this, especially in a context in which we can't all, even on this panel, necessarily agree on strategies and tactics. So what do you think about tactics, and what can we do as lawyers? Most of us here are practitioners that are listening, I think, and also as academics and people at law schools and universities. What can be done to enable free speech, first principles, wherever we're living and working? And so I think I'll start with Todd this time and go back through. So let's go for it, and keep an eye on me. I might be trying to wiggle my little fingers if we need to move on to the next person, because this is going to fly by, and we'll have closing statements in the last 5 minutes. So no matter, everybody will get their very brief rebuttal at the very end as well.
This sounds good. I'll just tick off a couple things. First, I want to politely disagree with my dear old friend Eugene, longstanding friend, when he said that faculty were inattentive to this question. A lot of faculty. I think that's being far too charitable to most of our colleagues in the academy. They knew what was going on, but most academics are just cowards. They're unwilling to stand up for this. There's a serious collective action problem for any faculty member trying to stand up for unpopular speech on campus, and they know what they're exposing themselves to. So I think that so what we need are essentially substitutes for courage. I think telling presidents and faculty, get more backbone with the kind of people who are in universities today, I think is just not going to work. So here's some thoughts I have. And I want to say at the outset, all of these will have both intended and unintended consequences. And I want to emphasize, I'm aware that they have unintended consequences. So one example I would say, a lot of conservatives like is, let's get rid of tenure. I would really ask people to think about that twice. And obviously, I have some interest in this, but the reality is the left is always going to be more ruthless than conservatives in firing people who say things they don't like. We've seen this over and over again. Employment, universities, As Greg Lukianoff in his new book says, twice as many people have been fired during the past 10 years as during the entire McCarthy era among the faculty. So eliminating tenure will just allow the left to fire conservative professors, and I don't think it'll go both ways. So let me say a couple things I think will work. The first is I think we should look at the Solomon Amendment, which requires the universities to allow military recruiters on campus at the pain of losing federal funds if they don't. They don't want military on campus. They allow them on campus because they know the government is serious about enforcing that. I think that a second thing that is worth considering, especially at state universities, is a free speech ombudsman whose entire job would be to and would be accountable for free speech policies on campus, of articulating and defending a free speech policy on campus, and they would be required to report to the state legislature or whoever how this works. So in a transparent sort of way. The third thing, and this is where I'm going to close this thought on, is the only reason we have these rules, and I've been saying this for years, the only reason we have these rules is because the left believes it will never be used against them. Conservatives for 2 decades have been saying, one of these days, this could be used against you, right? And they just laugh because they know it isn't. We don't have the power to do it. We don't have the will to do it. I'm not saying we should, but in the end, if it's a power game, a little elementary game theory here, tit for tat, right? The equilibrium we want to be at is free speech for everybody, where people can speak. If all is going on is the left keeps breaking the rules and punishing people, and we don't, then they're going to just keep punishing people. It's as simple as that. And that's the lesson we've learned from, I believe, this ongoing thing with the Israeli thing is now when they're being held to their own rules, all of a sudden they're at least saying the same thing. I don't think it's going to last. I think in 6 months, we're going to go right back to where we are. But at least in the short run, their hypocrisy is being exposed. They're being held to their own standards, and they're at least saying the right things. And frankly, I'll say also, when it comes, if you think about the judicial boycott for clerkships for Yale and Stanford, obviously there's, people might have concerns about that. But here's the deal. If you think free speech is important, then what's your strategy, right? What we know is that Yale and Stanford both now have said that they're in favor of free speech ever since that happened. And I could guarantee you those statements would not have been made otherwise after shouting down Kyle Duncan and that sort of thing. And so what I would say is we've been trying the same thing for 20 years, whatever that strategy is, and it's been a terrible strategy. It really doesn't work. And so what is your strategy? My strategy is the only things that I see that can happen to get us to a better equilibrium is some sort of tit-for-tat strategy where we hold them to their own rules. We use the legal resources and other things that are at our disposal, because otherwise it's going to just keep going the same way in the same direction.
I want to hear from Jay after that.
Yeah.
I want to make sure you have a couple of minutes to say what you're thinking on sort of where can we go from here?
Yeah, my goal in life has been to give conservatives strategy in dealing with liberals. No, I'm actually happy to give some thoughts. I think, first of all, you guys should understand that for a lot of us liberals, the jig is up. Like we were willing to go along with a lot of stuff that because we didn't understand that it was all a farce. The microaggressions and all of that, my first impulse is I want everyone to feel comfortable. I've been feeling sick this whole time because I've been referring to Eugene as Gene, and then I realized I think he actually prefers being called. You don't care? Well, that's
no, good. I do prefer Eugene, but okay. No big deal.
Okay, but I understand you're an adult and you can handle that. But I still would rather call you by what you want to be called. I think I'm always going to default to that. I think that there has been an awakening by a lot of people that all this ideology that we've heard from I don't believe it's left. I think it's kind of the extreme progressives doesn't mean anything. It's Todd, what you said at the beginning. This isn't about truth. The words are all made up. And what I would urge conservatives who may not agree with me on a lot of political issues, but probably agree on this big point is don't sweep all liberals up together. This is a time when you can grab us. So what I think that I can do, I view this as a huge opportunity. This is the moment when this kind of radical agenda has been laid bare, and it is clear that there's no real consistency of thought, and something else is going on. So what I've been trying to do is use this as an opportunity to speak, and hopefully speak in a different way, and say, and from a liberal perspective of how far away are we getting from what it means to be Americans? And I think the progressive left has again revealed itself. Let them do it. Let them do it. Don't start saying this is all Democrats, we can't speak to them. You know, the thing that, so when we said in response to President Gay, when she now said free speech is the most important thing, our response was, this is crazy making. It's hard to imagine us going to Harvard again, to the campus at all, because this is just la la land. People said, oh, you want to cancel President Gay. That's what you're in this for. And I said, no, absolutely not. What I want President Gay to do is engage in a debate. Go on to town hall. Go to MSNBC if you want, CNN. If I were her, I'd go on to Fox. You want to go with your critics and explain what it is you're thinking. And I think that is what the push should be from kind of the rational majority of Americans, which is, if it is true, if they believe in these things, then they should speak about it. I'm actually not offended. If someone said to me, I want to debate whether there should be a genocide of the Jewish people, my view is, okay, I'm happy to have that debate. I'm not saying I'm the best spokesperson for that, but I think I would do okay. I think I can win that argument. I'm obviously aware that I don't want to elevate people, and give them voices if no one's heard of them. But if there's someone who already has an audience, let's have that debate and see how it shakes out. The worst thing is to just, and Todd, I'm not suggesting you're doing this at all, and I appreciate everybody here has a thick skin, but the worst thing to do is to kind of push off our opponents and kind of just say they're totally lost and unreachable. It may be true, but we can figure that out through engaging with them, and so that's kind of how I would leave it on this point, at least.
Jay, what a superb commentary. If I might just note from the peanut gallery, thank you for those comments. Can we now move it over to Eugene or Gene?
No, Eugene.
To Eugene, that was a bad joke. To say something, then we'll hear from Professor Bernstein briefly, and if we have time for just a one or two sentence, slogan of a closing comment to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, so one thing I very much agree with Todd on is you have to figure out answers that work with human nature, not against. Faculty should be more courageous. Kind of goes against human nature because it's human nature not to be courageous. One reason there are all these poems and past millennia, movies, novels, plays celebrating courage is that they're necessary to kind of try to elevate a virtue, which, while important at the social level, is personally very costly. So we need to set up some things that work with human nature. One of them may very well be legislation. Like, it's human nature for people to say, I want to follow the law because otherwise I might get sued, might get into trouble at work because there's a lawsuit against the university and on my watch. So it may be that you want to have statutes that first at least make clear to public universities that they have to comply with First Amendment norms and maybe define them more precisely. Some states have indeed enacted that, including my own California. There was a movement, the so-called Goldwater bills from the Goldwater Institute. And those might be helpful, I think. And maybe at the federal level too, the conservative in me says there are very few problems that are so bad that they can't be made worse by federal regulation. But maybe this is an area where we had problems partly caused by federal regulation that have to be solved by other things. So maybe it is time to say that there ought to be a condition of federal funds ought to be speech protection, just as conditions of federal funds are non-discrimination based on race and sex and religion should be a condition of non-discrimination based on political ideology and various other things. Maybe that might be worthwhile, but again, it'll be working, assuming you can get it through Congress, it'll be working with human nature. And maybe even if you can't get it through Congress, maybe proposing it might be politically viable, although I'd want to, politically valuable for the cause of free speech, although I'd want to talk to kind of people who know their politics more about this. It may very well be that mandating some institutional structure, so there's some high-level official whose job it is to protect free speech, the free speech ombudsman that Todd suggested, that might be maybe useful. I don't know, have enough experience with university administration to know for sure, but it might be very helpful. I do think continuing to litigate and winning victories in court, which in general courts have been quite friendly in this area, not uniformly, but generally speaking, I think that would be helpful. But the last thing I just want to close with is that there are good arguments aimed at self-interest that can persuade some people. It's true that it requires some level of threat to liberal speech and progressive speech. And I don't think, as a matter of right and of kind of my understanding of right and rule of law, that I ought to be calling for them just as a tactical matter. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think I ought to be. Thankfully, human nature being what it is, there are already lots of people who are calling for it. There have been these kinds of restrictions imposed in various states. There are calls to suppress sharply anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian speech, including some of it including things that may be labeled calls for genocide, but really what our calls for is for really nasty behavior in a foreign wars being known for millennia as being full of nasty behavior. And I don't want to try to suppress that kind of debate. I'm quite comfortable protecting it at universities, but there are lots of natural pressures. And I think principled defenders of free speech should say, look, there are all of these restrictions on left-wing speech. Maybe you ought to remember that you aren't always going to be in charge, and that in many ways you're already not in charge, you being the people on the left from the center on. Let me just close with one example. There's a case I'm involved with, so I'm a lawyer in it, so take what I say in a grain of salt. It's pending before the Supreme Court, NRA v. Volokh. And the claim is that the New York financial regulatory authorities used their power over financial entities to try to make things difficult for the NRA, to try to cut off financial services to them. We are now being represented in the Supreme Court, co-represented by the ACLU. Not because the ACLU likes the NRA, but I think, and what I'm about to say is not meant to derogate them in any way. I think it's very much the way I think they ought to be behaving. They think, look, this could happen to maybe Planned Parenthood, it could happen to various other groups. We need to be there to protect free speech, not just because it's the right thing to do, which I think many of them do believe, but because it's going to protect many of our core constituencies as well. It's possible to work out that, if it's possible to work out that alliance in the judicial context with the ACLU, I think it's possible to work out pro-free speech alliances with at least some people on the left at universities.
Excellent. David, do you have a brief comment for our closing remarks? And just in case you want to wrap them up in there, for the closing round, I was just going to quickly ask for thoughts on how to push the moment towards more speech, as opposed to a new coalition for more censorship. So, you now have 3 questions to answer in one.
Right. Well, that's great, because actually that additional question was more or less what I would have addressed anyway. So I think we need two strategies simultaneously, and there are different groups that should be pursuing each one. On the one hand, we need the Academic Freedom Alliance and FIRE and like-minded groups to be pushing for getting rid of speech codes, interpreting hostile environment very narrowly, protecting academic freedom, fighting for the Calvin principles that universities should be neutral. And that could be a cross-ideological alliance. But I think it's also very useful to have these lawsuits that I mentioned earlier, to go back to my original comments, where the Jewish students are claiming that we're putting aside, we have hostile environment claims, we also have claims of unequal treatment. Because again, if you go back to my initial remarks, the reason these speech codes or speech restrictions kind of flourished and flowered to begin with was to protect only certain groups. But it turns out that the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act doesn't protect Black people or Hispanic people or any other specific minority group from discrimination. It protects from discrimination based on race, national origin, ethnicity, and so forth. And thus, everyone who is a member of any group can sue. You could sue for anti-white speech, just as much as anti-white hostile environment, anti-Jewish hostile environment. And since the whole point of having these codes is to prefer certain groups, if the courts hold, as they really must, that the standards have to be the same, whether it's a Black student or a white student or a Jewish student or a Hispanic student, suing for having their concern, for a hostile environment, and now for unequal treatment potentially. That means that that whatever the strictest standard you apply to, say, speech that you don't like that relates to race that may be derogatory or seen as derogatory to Black people, you have to apply to people saying things about white people. And then you don't want to have them anymore, because how do you have critical race theory if you can't say anything negative about white people, right? So that would undermine the support, I think, of these speech codes or speech restrictions on the left, and that would be a good thing. So that would push people to the FIRE and Academic Freedom Alliance position. But I would also add that, however, that this hasn't come up, so I'm going to add. You're not supposed to add in new things in your conclusions, but when you're right, at least. But I'm going to do it anyway. No matter how well this issue comes out, the underlying problem of speech and academic freedom and so forth at universities, I shouldn't say the problem. The biggest problem is not specific protests or the occasional professor who gets fired, although those can have chilling effects and be bad too. The real problem is the academic monoculture in whole university departments, in the university bureaucracy, that excludes non-left-wing voices or even just heterodox voices on particular issues, like try getting hired in an anthropology or sociology department if your paper is about social contagion and how that affects transgenderism in the United States, right? No one's going to hire you almost anywhere because that's just forbidden to talk about. And that can't be dealt with easily with lawsuits. That's not something FIRE and the Academic Freedom Alliance really undertake, and that's something that will have to be done by some combination of legislation, especially at public universities, by some bold university presidents. If anyone who's actually bold and has some moral courage can become a university president these days, by constituents of the university, like donors and students selecting what universities they want to go to.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's pass it to Professor Zywicki briefly, because for his closing remark, we have about 45 seconds each. So let's please respect each other's time. Professor Zywicki has an exam he has to give in about 5 minutes. So he gets to go first, and then he'll be logging off to go do that, to do that.
Thanks. First, I want to emphasize this is a deep problem. When Nature magazine writes something like there's a fine balance between academic freedom and the protection of the dignity and right of individuals and human groups, we're talking about a serious problem. Even Marcuse said, literally, scientific freedom is inviolable. So I'll say a couple things in closing. First, I just want to echo what others have said about Jay's comments. Jay, thanks for being here. I thought those were very instructive, and I appreciate your thoughts on this, in particular, being with us. The second thing is, I think every university should adopt the Calvin report. Anybody who doesn't know the Calvin report should look at it. It is institutional neutrality on issues that are unrelated to the interest of a university. When a university weighs in on one side or the other, they are implicitly favoring some speech over others. I think the Calvin Report provides the way forward. The third thing I would commend to all people who are interested in this is at Antonin Scalia Law School, we adopted a statement, a faculty statement on classroom dialogue and debate, where we improve, in my view, on the Chicago principles. And the idea there is to create sort of some degree of obligation on faculty and students and how we're supposed to interact in the classroom and create norms of proper ways of interacting. I would encourage everybody to take a look at that and think about how that might apply to your school or your classroom. Thanks.
Professor Volokh?
Well, we've come to the end of the time, I think. I don't have much to add. Again, I just think it's important to ask yourself, who is it out there who can be on your side? And not just who is it out there who's against you. You need to know who's against you. But if you focus too much on them, or if you're too dispirited by them, you're not going to figure out who it is who's persuadable. So the question is who it is whom you can persuade, whether they're on your side because they share basic principles or even different basic principles, but they share common practical interests, and figure out how to reach out to them. That's the real question here.
Mr. Edelson.
So this is going to sound surprising when we talk about strategies, which is that not self-interest at all, but I generally think for some reason that class actions are a pretty good strategy. And I feel like the big headline out of this is we've got an agreement from everyone that is the solution to most problems. That's a joke. But I do think that there is a role in litigation. And I think there's a role specifically in this context. So the Title VI theory is interesting. The more interesting theory to me, which we're going to see more and more come out over the next few months, is a false advertising theory, which is that a lot of people went to these universities being told it is going to be a safe space for everybody. We are going to treat everyone as individuals. And that has been laid bare. And my view is that litigation is going to spark a different type of discussion, because at some point the Harvards of the world are going to have to respond to that and say, well, we were putting out all of these statements, and we believe it? I don't know. I guess we kind of believed it, except as President Gay famously said, now it's contextual. And I think that sometimes litigation can actually drive important types of debates. We saw that with the debates over diversity. And once it gets to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court makes the decision, then there's a totally different type of conversation. Now, I would like to point out that, and this is kind of just a pitch in general, and I'm sorry I've gone over the 45 seconds, is that we're seeing more conservative lawyers get involved in this type of litigation advocacy. Will Consovoy, who unfortunately has passed, I thought was one of the leaders in this space, and you're seeing more and more conservative firms use class actions or other types of kind of high impact litigation to not just spur change, but also spur a much wider and more sophisticated discussion. So more lawsuits.
All right, we are out of time. I do want to thank our moderator and panelists for a delightful conversation. On behalf of the Federalist Society, I appreciate all of you and our audience for joining and participating in the event. As always, please note all expressions of opinion offered today are those of the experts on today's panel. We welcome listener feedback by email at info@fedsoc.org. Thanks again for joining us today. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. We are adjourned.